And we're live. Okay. All right. I just want to thank everybody for coming to our very first Game Masters workshop. Talking about a specific subject off the grid. And before we start, I really want to give a quick shout out to Roll20 that kind of brought us all together. It's a really great program. And anybody that has been thinking about GMing but only had local groups, really try to get into supporting Roll20. It's a great platform. And we're going to have little links, as long as Roll20 allows it, underneath the video. First off, we're just going to go down to each of our GMs, and we're going to start with the left side, Emmerich. A little bit about your experience.
You mean GMing experience or
yeah, your GMing
playing?
experience.
Okay. Well, I'm a Croatian GM. Actually, we don't have a very developed role-playing culture here, so I don't have as much experience as perhaps I could have. Most of it is centered around the capital, and sadly, to my great disappointment, I don't actually live there. Most of my GMing experience has actually been off the grid due to the nature of the systems that I've been GMing, mostly storytelling games from White Wolf. So basically Mage the Ascension, Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, and the related New World of Darkness franchises.
That's pretty much all off the grid.
Yes, actually, all of them are. They don't incorporate any sort of a map system or anything like that, unless you perhaps invent something for yourself.
I feel like you're just coming here just to check up on and make sure I'm explaining it.
No. Actually, I've started GMing Pathfinder due to, shall we say, popular consensus or peer pressure, because I actually have a lot of players in my hometown, Osijek, where basically the most popular game system is, as everywhere else, D&D, and most recently Pathfinder, of course. Most of my players are far more experienced in Pathfinder and especially 3.5 than I am, so it's kind of tough going. And I've noticed of late, as in the last several months, that the grid system that Pathfinder uses, which essentially turns the game into a tabletop tactical game, is really slowing things down.
That is going to be one of the main issues we're going to cover.
Exactly, that's why I joined.
Awesome.
Basically, I think that perhaps it takes away more from the game than it would have added, because I am aware that D&D wasn't always a grid-based, map-based system. It used to be solely based on your imagination and the mind's eye, and somewhere around 3.5 it went tabletop, and it apparently never turned away from that, and perhaps that really damages the experience more than it adds to it. And also, I've been experimenting with GURPS, which is even worse, because there you have to keep track of character orientation and stuff like that, and it really becomes very onerous and exceptionally tiresome after a while.
I think a lot of people are going to share these the same type of concerns and issues, and why we're actually going to be focusing on Pathfinder specifically. And we're going to move on to John.
Thank you for giving me these few minutes.
Of course.
All right. See, I've been gaming for about a year and GMing for 6 months or so. I was GMing D&D 4E, but I was realizing I was spending more time having to build maps and everything than we'd actually play during the week. So I've switched over to Pathfinder for an not Pathfinder, Savage Worlds, for an easier game to run off the map, and also the reason I am here. So reduce my prep time, as it were.
Reminds me of an article about the lazy GM. It's a
Yep.
great one. Justin, you're up.
So yeah, I'm pretty much completely new to role playing and anything GM related in general. Let's see, my buddy Chris has some buddies he plays with D&D, I think 3.5 with, and we just recently got back into a really old. That's Chris. We just got into a really old role-playing game from back when I was like in middle school. It was Buck Rogers in the 25th century, and so I've been looking at how to maybe adapt it to GURPS. And yeah, that's about it.
Interesting. Very cool. Malcolm.
Yeah, thanks. I know my name's on the profile. It's a little messed up. But that's just my YouTube account, my other YouTube account. But I've been mostly trying to work on GM. I'm a bit of a new GM, to just point out immediately. I'm not particularly as familiar with the rules as I'd like to be for Pathfinder, and I mostly play Pathfinder. Although I've been thinking about. I originally wanted to do 3.5, but I thought Pathfinder close enough, and it's a lot more easy to access things online with the Pathfinder wiki, D20 PFSRD. They got good resources if you're ever interested in going through Pathfinder. But I've been thinking about branching out, maybe trying other RPGs, such as the Star Wars RPG, which I always thought was interesting, and Savage Worlds, which is something that John has suggested to me, and I think I might check it out with him. The reason why I came to this workshop is because I have a specific quick story that I'll just go through, but I was GMing a one-shot for Pathfinder, and we were using a grid to generally go through it, and I kind of underestimated the amount of min-maxing that my players were going to commit to, because this was mostly combat one-shot, and as a result of that, it completely threw off my whole map setup. And so for future reference, rather than having that become such a major problem, I've been looking for resources that would relate to keeping the game off the grid, as Keegan has been offering. And I decided to come here in order to investigate that for myself and see whether or not I can apply it to my own games when I fully conduct them. Also, just want to quickly plug this Pathfinder game world I've been working on with a couple friends called Medio Solium. I'm sure Keegan will leave a link later on, as well as to my YouTube account, Gamer Malcolm Games. I've only done one video with it, and I stopped doing as a result of lack of interest. But if more people wanted to watch stuff like that, or if more people were interested in the video, I'd be more than happy to make more. That's really about it. And thank you. I would like to thank Keegan again for creating this workshop, and that's really all. That's all I got.
Thank you. Thomas, unfortunately, is having mic issues. If you want to type, oh, look at it, he typed it. You'll be able to see it in the video, but briefly it says, I have very little GMing experience. I've ran a few one-shots and modules, but nothing major. Since moving for college, my usual group moved the games to Roll20. We just declared our most recent game dead due to scheduling conflicts, and that says that he's interested in going off the grid because I feel that tactical combat is everything wrong with Pathfinder. That is a huge highlight of what this workshop will be, and the benefits of going off the grid. And yeah, he says that he has most of his issues I have with it. I'm primarily a narrative, which Off the Grid strongly supports, and I'm looking for ways to make the game more conducive to that playstyle. Combat is the hardest element to deal with. That is a strong sentiment. If not mentioned before, my name is GM Keegan, and I'm one of the founders of the GM Academy on Roll20, and we're going to highlight some strong principles today. Here, I believe. And what we're going to go over is benefits of using the mind's eye rather than maps and grids. And a lot of this is actually might sound a little redundant because you guys brought up a lot of the issues and concerns of either that you want to have a smoother game, or you just prefer a narrative over the tactical. And one thing we want to highlight is that this is an option. Some people deeply, deeply enjoy rolling on grids and having that tactical feel. And we don't want to take away people's fun and say there's only one way to have fun, because that's not what a role-playing game's about. It's a game meant to have fun. But right at the top, I've seen this in lots of forums, and I really want to give him credit. His name is Kamikaze Midget. This is one of the best ways to describe what we call off the grid, is don't sweat the small stuff. That principle, almost like a prime directive, so to speak, is going to be highlighted constantly through the gridless system. A lot of the issues are going to get resolved by just having that in mind. And then we're going to continue on to addressing the feelings of being overwhelmed by not having the tokens, etc., and maps and everything. Because some people sometimes try to translate in a literal sense of what going from gridded to gridless, and we're going to deal with those feelings. We're also going to translate certain rules to fit a system and ways to organize and manage not just battles, but all encounters. And then that highlighting that prime principle, and that's right up top. That is the don't sweat the small stuff. Got to remember, fun is first. One of the first examples is this is a typical looking map. Everybody loads it up and goes, okay, I'm the wizard. I want to shoot this goblin, so I have to figure out, okay, I'm going to move, and then I have to figure out how many steps he can take, and then I'm going to roll and attack him. And that's a board game environment if that's how you're treating it. You would lose a lot of what I consider the fun part, the describing the entire scene, of actually like breathing life into it, where you get the smell and the sounds and the sweat, and everybody gets concerned, because there's truly nothing greater than your own imagination. And this 2D field that we see here, personally, it takes away a lot of that. Just remember, everybody can see what's being typed over there. And so the first thing is, if either one, I need a volunteer. And if we have more than one volunteer, everybody roll a 1d20, and whoever is the highest, that's going to be my first guinea pig. Because what we're going to do is go through a little session to really highlight the differences. I described a little bit, but I really want to show the differences, because truly there's nothing better than a critical fail for volunteering.
All the time. All the time.
That's too classic right there.
Especially when I'm a player.
So we got 3 volunteers, 4 volunteers, and so far it looks like Thomas is it. Okay, Thomas. This is going to be a little tricky since you're having the mic issue. What you would normally do is, how would you encourage greater narrative in a system like this? What are the concerns you personally have? If you're the GM and you're running it, what do you have? Excellent. Okay, Thomas is bringing up how do you get the players to think beyond the map, and that's one of the negatives. As he rolls around and says, "Okay, I'm explaining the situation," and talks about these goblins and how to move them. Everybody now is just focused on this 2D map, and at home maybe people aren't using Roll20; they're using them local. But we're going to highlight this because we really want to emphasize the primarily what we play. We play on Roll20. This is what everybody's focused on, is counting the math, and then, oh no, okay, now I'm in a flanking position. I've succeeded, so I can get an extra bonus. And that is like one of the biggest concerns. And I'm going to go through and find out what is everybody else's big concern with this, or biggest issue, I should say, with this style? Now that you have your wizard with the goblin, if anybody has, oh, my cat just decided they want to play. That what is your guys' biggest issue with this style that takes people out of the immersion? Because truly, we're all just playing a story. Because Thomas brought up the good point, is people are looking only at the map, and you want to get them beyond that. Yeah. If you have something, Malcolm?
I just wanted to ask. I didn't really have a question.
Oh. Yes.
Just making sure.
Okay. So what is the biggest concern that when you look at this, does anybody else have an idea of how to bring people off this map? How to convince your players to think beyond this little 2D grid? Because right now we're talking about the limitations of just a map.
Well, we could take the map away and the tokens and everything associated with it.
Then we'll truly get into the benefits of narrative. But right here, what are some other things that you guys run into that you would like to eliminate? Because right now, Thomas wants to encourage his players more to think beyond the map. Because right now, the map is naturally going to draw all your players to it. They're going to look and they're like, okay, this is my focus. This is where their attention is being drawn to, which naturally takes them out of their own imagination.
Well, I can think of one thing. Well, as you can see, here on this map, everything is revealed, and I've noticed that a lot of GMs do that. They don't use the fog of war system because it's too complicated, or a lot of things that the player shouldn't be aware of. They're aware of prematurely.
Yeah, I would agree on that point. I agree with you. I also think it gives players an overview of the map when they really. I'm going off of what Emmerich was saying. I feel like I agree with you in that they've seen too much, but it also takes them out of the roleplay aspect as well, because they can see all of this. They understand. They kind of get a gist of it from the GM's point, and I don't really think that if you're going to create a proper narrative, the character should be aware of everything that is going on. They should be only aware of what their spectrum of the situation is, like their point of view. If that makes any sense at all.
It does.
That is a very, very good point, because we're talking about why the strong narrative, or with them using the theater of mind. These are different terms people use. Is we're just talking about a gridless, mapless system. And right now, when you use these tools that are grids and maps, you now lose out on some of the things you guys mentioned, such as perspective, not utilizing the surrounding more because you're thinking of it in a purely tactical, how many moves before I get in range to hit with my warrior. And how far do I need to get to shoot my arrow?
Oh, and another thing though too, I feel like it's a lot more like watching a movie. It's a lot more like watching a movie and not like playing a game, in the sense that you do have this overview. You're not really involved in necessarily what your player is viewing from the situation. And again, going back to that, you lose a sense of role play. If that makes any sense. It's like a movie. You're not really you're seeing it, but you're not participating.
Yes, oftentimes it's referred to as people lose that cinematic feel because they can understand what the illustration is.
Yeah.
Because people generally want to be immersed in a role-playing universe because it's all just fantasy, whether it's sci-fi or horror or modern. It's still just a fantasy. We're just creating a cooperative narrative to have fun. That's the prime principle of what a role-playing game does. Anybody else? John or Justin?
Yeah, I want to bring up a point here real quick. Part of this is you're also limiting your options to what you see. I mean, this scene here, it's a wrecked caravan, and there's probably a horse or two, or oxen or something that was hauling these wagons. They're probably off behind a tree somewhere because you can't see it the players aren't going to think, oh, I'm going to use those as a distraction or something like that. It limits their options.
Excellent point. That also applies to the speed of what if, for some reason, that your players wanted to go off to the road and want to take a southern road rather than another road. So say you developed an entire map and they didn't even take that road and they took a different one. Having that random chance, you're going to have to pause the campaign, set up this map real quick, and most likely won't add the details that John just mentioned. That you're going to lose some of that environment just so you can build this map real quick and have an encounter.
Particularly frustrating, if I may, when it's an open world game and not a scripted one.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, the Kingmaker Adventure Path for Pathfinder, which I'm running now, and that one has a lot of these issues, where the players will just randomly wander into a new hex, and you won't have a map. Yep, and then you have to generate one. Fortunately, there are places where you can do that, and it takes a long time to set it up.
Yes.
So I was just thinking, as far as what you're saying before about, okay, so you have the grid, but how can you pull players a little bit more away from the grid? The grid kind of only really gives you kind of a visual overview of everything, but isn't there still plenty of room to describe like sounds, smells, everything that wouldn't just include just an overview of kind of where things are relative to each other?
Very good point. I just want to reiterate, we're not trying to we want this as an option, and those that are looking for all the things that you guys mentioned, that want more of those features of a greater variety, more details, the smells, bringing just the environment to life to make it a more true, living, breathing world, so to immerse your characters, because that's the whole purpose of as a GM, is we're trying to create something for the players to interact with. And sometimes a gridded map system like this feels too flat. And we want to add more of those features that we've created, because this is just a creative process, and we want to share that creativity with our players. Yes, Justin.
So I was just thinking, what do you think of like basically starting out with like a blank grid? If you say still wanted to use a grid, but then as you describe things, you place things on the grid as you describe them, instead of just having everything set up from the beginning, where you can see everything.
I actually never heard of that option. Having that, I would see, is running into the exact same problems, just slower. Is you would have, okay, I don't have the grid set up, so it's just a, or it's like you don't have a map, you just have a grid. You're still going to fill it up, and people are still going to end up with the exact same issue of, once everything's in place, it'll still just look like a grid system, and they'll revert back into the tactic of what does it look like. And then you have all your tokens, and hopefully you find all your tokens and place it. And that could be a slowdown for some people. It could be a slowdown that you're looking for all the tokens just to place, when it could just be easily described, which we're going to show in the next part. But before we do that, yes, Malcolm?
This is actually a technical issue I just wanted to point out to you. If you highlight your camera on Google Hangouts, you can actually keep it on there, and everybody can still talk. I think that's how it works. Because I have you highlighted. Yeah, I have you highlighted. Yeah, and even when I have you highlighted, I can see what you're broadcasting. You should highlight yourself as well if you can. Just click on your.
Yeah, I can't. I won't, because it'll loop it. Don't do that. There you go, YouTube.
Okay. I think that.
For everybody else, that would help out.
Okay.
Just to remind everybody on YouTube, this is kind of an experiment. This is our first workshop, so thank you for bearing with us as we get through some of these interesting times.
Yeah, I just thought I'd let you know.
No, appreciate that. So that's one way to use, or how some people choose to use it. Another way that we use Roll20 is typically if you're just around a couch instead of a table and you guys are just role-playing, you don't have a lot of pictures. But Roll20 allows us to grab pictures and put it to good use in creating a feeling without having to describe everything in it. And these two pictures are ways to do that. When we're first looking at it, and we look at the one to the right, without even describing much, I need somebody to come up with, if they showed this picture to their players, how would you describe the picture on the right? I need a volunteer for that. A quick storyteller. Everybody's volunteering again. Roll. Like everything, we're going to roll a d20 to settle it. Justin's intimidated by the 9. Doesn't want to roll a d20. Oh, there it is. Okay. I creamed it. Okay, now Justin. Now, as just an exercise, this is one really good example I use to just create an environment, and we actually use an entire scenario that took about an hour and a half to go through just off of this picture, because it was just to basically like set the mood like we use music for. And the rest of it is all going to be narrative. And this is the freedom of narrative over a grid. So give us a quick thing. We'll be your players, you'll be the GM, and give us a little snippet of what we're experiencing in this with this picture on the right.
Okay, so complete newbie here, so have to bear with me. But so okay, you're all standing in a forest. It's misty, it's kind of dimly lit. Off into the distance, you see a small cottage, and the forest is really dense, and there's lots of foliage around you.
Okay, so now we have a basic scenario, and all he did was create something in a random situation. He says, okay, we're in a forest, gives a little detail, and then that's it. Now, without having to go to a map or a grid, we can do even more, because what if they want to investigate that house? You don't have to build it. You go straight into right here where it says that we gain the benefit of using a gridless system, because now he can describe a house. Malcolm, since you were the other volunteer, bring the rest of us as players as if we opened the door to that house. Now you would describe what?
All right. Also new GM, so I'll do my best here. But
we always appreciate that.
As you walk inside, the smell of maple syrup completely engulfs the room as you enter. You feel a sense of warmth, almost as if a fire might be going on in the fireplace, and somebody might have been here recently, or is still here, for all you know. But the door was unlocked, so it wasn't really a bit of a problem. You also notice that there's a bookshelf containing various old-looking tomes, perhaps those of forgotten magics or a form of wealth of knowledge of information. But for the most part, it seems oddly inviting, despite the fact that you see no one else inside.
Not that. If you had a grid and map system of this house, players would naturally want to go, okay, I'm going to explore because he created a map. But what if your group says, that's not interesting to me. I'm going to leave. And so all they did was get to the first little part of your house that you spent time on, and they leave. With a gridded system, that wastes your time. And now what if they want to go somewhere else? They just said, oh, we're done. We'll just keep on searching. Maybe I want to hunt in the forest because we need food. So the narrative gives you that freedom. That's another one of the benefits of it. That freedom, because to be honest, we use this house as somebody got kidnapped and got brought in, and it was just a musty old place that had nothing, filled with cobwebs. But as we see, the GM used it in a completely different direction. So this is almost just like used as a tool like music, that we just create something and we can go in any direction that the players want, and we get the freedom to do it. Yeah. And Malcolm has a question.
Yes, I know I was kind of freeballing with that description, but would you normally suggest for these type of thematic images that help generate the proper setting and tone for the adventure? Would you suggest that we have notes prepared for these situations, or or depending on how your improv works, would you just suggest that we simply just freeball it?
One of the benefits of going off the grid is that you can go in any direction and have that type of freedom of improvisation and go anywhere. Yeah, I also enjoyed it. To me, it's more, that's like a GM style question rather than particularly of how to use this screen. This is an example of how to use something very simple, and yet you can spend a great amount of time here, or they can move on. Some people like to put little notes to describe, hey, what's happening, let me add music to it, or whatnot. And you could just keep on spinning, because what if they meet somebody inside that they didn't expect or you didn't expect? Well, one of the benefits of going gridless is you now could just create them without having a token to represent it.
All right, I was just wondering. Thanks.
No, that's an excellent question. Does anybody else have a question? We got CB. Yes, sir.
Yes. Well, it's not really a question, but I say in this sort of a situation, if you got an excellent storyteller in your group, and if you don't have anything specific planned, this is a great opportunity to let your players kind of put some of themselves into your narrative you're building.
Yes, that's actually a very, very, very good point. Of one of the reasons why we highlight the gridless option is it allows for more of that freedom and ability to draw in your players so they can be to have a greater part and a greater role in developing the story. So next week, all they're thinking about is what they remember as a character and they did, because they got to add so much to it. So that's a very good point, CB. Now to the left, this picture could be 3 or a horde. It could be lots of zombies. And having a picture like this is another way to use NPC battles or to describe an environment without having all the tokens. Now, before we do that, how would you guys keep track of an entire fight with just these? When you normally do it, how do you keep track of all of the different NPCs? Very good point, Justice. Typically tap on the grid. Does anybody have an idea of what you would do without a grid? We could just shout it out. Paper is one way. But suppose that they are killing the zombies too fast, and you want to increase it. You'd have to create more tokens and keep track of more stuff. This is where don't sweat the small stuff comes in, because we're going to play out a little battle. And I'm going to need 2 volunteers to be generic warriors. And I'm going to give a little example, and then later on we're going to have other people GM a battle. Malcolm's rolling high. Don't we always love that? Okay, so Thomas and CB, you guys are just generic warriors. Emmerich, not even up to the plate. You guys are just generic warriors. Everything's going to be D20, and all your damage is going to be 1d6. $13, 2 13s. We'll hit you up on the next one. In fact, I'll let you be my GM next time. is so the way I would handle it is I'm going to start out with 3 zombies. And remember what our prime principle was? Prime principle.
Don't sweat the small stuff.
Yes, over and over and over. That is going to be the basics thing. And this is when I'm going to show you the man behind the curtain. Is when people look at it, they think a lot more is going on than it actually is. Because I can look at it and go, okay, there's 3 zombies, 2 warriors, let's roll it. And then the first thing is, on a grid system, you would step up and what? CB, what would you do? Did we lose CB?
Yeah, my audio cut out for just a second.
Right. What would you normally do? On a grid system, you're going to attack a zombie, you do what?
The grid system, the first thing is I'm going to count out my moves and move up to the nearest zombie.
Okay. But now that there's no moves, what do you do? How would you handle that?
Run up to the zombie?
Okay.
Sorry, my audio is cutting out. Maybe bring somebody else in for this.
Run into the zombie?
Okay, that's a sorry about his poor mic. That's a good point right there. You say I'm going to count my moves and run to the zombie, or I'm going to run up to the zombie. Now he just created a more cinematic feel, because he's like expressing an action. And the don't sweat the small stuff. One thing we've done in Pathfinder is removed the move, the standard, the minor action, and the free action. We removed all that and just put in place an action. Everybody gets to do something, whatever it is. And everything else is going to be the GM calling in. And because of that, this is a very important part, is you need to instill trust in your players that what you're judging is fair, because you're taking away everything. If the zombies are a short distance on a grid, that could be anything from 5 to 10 squares. But in a narrative, a gridless system, you just say, ask a player, and Malcolm wants to run up to a zombie. So you say, okay, you're in range.
Follow-up question?
Yes.
In regards to the in regards to having each person do an action, it's up to the GM's discretion to decide whether or not that action is feasible given the situation, correct? And would it be possible to deny players the action if it seems like too ridiculous or probably unlikely to be done in such time?
Who else thinks that way? Does everybody else have the similar feeling?
I mean, I'm just worried that with only one action available, I'm not like, couldn't you run up and is running up and stabbing it a one action in and of itself? And if so, like, what if the monster's like 300 feet away? Like, how do you?
Very good question. Very good question.
Like, that's what I'm just trying to go to.
Very good question. Does anybody else have a similar feeling of how to gauge battles like that? Emmerich?
Yeah, actually, I do have a good deal of experience with this because, as I said, I used to run World of Darkness games a lot. And in my experience, it's not that big of an issue because usually players will understand that certain actions are simply not feasible, and there is a certain degree of self-control involved, especially if you explain the situation in an appropriate manner, so they understand that perhaps there is too great of a distance between them and you, and so on. So,
would that be part of the description, though?
Like, that's a very, very good point that Emmerich brought out. Is now as a GM, you're actually given more freedom and opportunity to give further description, because perhaps you say, "I want to run at the horde." And the GM knows that it's a good distance away. Well, that doesn't say much. How many feet is a good distance away? Is that a long distance? Is that how many squares is that? What does that mean? But that actually gives the GM an opportunity to describe that. What's the environment look like? Is something happening that will slow them down? You can explain what the player is experiencing and what's in front of him, and realizes perhaps how far it is. And depending on the setting, whether it's a fantasy, perhaps you describe that it's like a bow shot away, and you know that it will take you more than one action to get there.
Okay, so after they've made the action to try and run towards it, they have to wait till their next action to continue running until they eventually get there and they start slicing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just have so instead of gauging it by feet or miles or any of that, you gauge it by the amount of actions it takes.
Perhaps it really comes down to nothing as cut and dry, because we're not breaking it down to the zombie is now 2 actions away, because then we're back to a grid system. What we're doing is eliminating specifics of distances. And you can describe things as short and long to give them an idea. Like your character knows that Emmerich, the warrior, understands that it will take another round to get there. Or he's climbing uphill and knows it will take another action of running. Or something could be coming up and you realize that you only made it halfway right now. Because everybody knows that there's always a turn-based system in role-playing, so it's a natural thing to go, okay, during my turn, and you go, oh, you've made it up to halfway up the hill.
So as the GM, you kind of let them know that they might have another round ahead of them? Like as they're getting close? Or
Yes.
Okay.
That's a very good way of putting it.
All right, thank you. That's all I had to ask.
If you're asking it, everybody's thinking it. That's how I view questions. Thomas, he's saying cinematic scenes, things like time and distance are mutable, open to interpretation. 300 feet could be a single action. It could be 5 actions. Very true. Some things are pacing. And that is what one of the benefits of having that narrative is. You get to control that rather than the grid dictate how long the battle's going to take. Now, it also encourages players to describe more. So who was one of my warriors? I know one of them had mic problems. Who was the other warrior?
I think Justin volunteered because he had the same role. So. He used a +10, so can I at least roll against him for that?
Oh, yeah, that was a joke.
He totally used a +10. Yeah, it was like 3. He rolled a 3. I rolled a 4. I should go.
I thought we had 2 guys roll. Oh, do I have to go back on now?
I'll roll. I can roll it real quick.
And Thomas. And Thomas rolled again. He keeps on rolling.
I think my mic is working a little bit better now.
Oh, okay. We got John back. I want to give him an opportunity. Poor guy lost his mic. Okay, so now as a player, you run up to the zombie, and all within one action, the GM asks, what do you want to do? And that is a much more freeing question than your turn to move and attack. Because now I'm asking, what do you want to do, Justin the warrior? What would you say as a player? And we want to give it a good example.
My example would be, I'm gonna stab that zombie right in the gut.
Are you yelling anything out?
I'm screaming at the top of my lungs, running up and stabbing into that guy.
What do you yell at the top of your lungs?
Leroy Jenkins.
Audible roar. Or not audible, but whatever the word I'm looking for there is.
I think you're looking for Leroy Jenkins.
Yeah, yes, Leroy Jenkins.
Okay, so that's what you were describing. Now, what does your player actually do in game?
In game, he moves up and makes an attack.
He has to actually say that. You actually have to yell.
This is Sparta. I'm
not actually going to yell.
Okay, so now these are thanks for being a good sport. That's actually what this encourages is he gets to describe all that going through it. And now roll. Say he rolls roll like a 1d10, and the zombie only has as the GM, it only has 2 health. So roll your 1d10 there, Justin.
Of course.
Okay, the zombie only had 1 health. Well, now that gives the GM to describe, okay, you did 1 point of damage, and you lower his health on the grid system, but now it also gives the GM to describe perhaps what's happening. Now that stab, when he swings his sword, and he wants to hit him right in his gut, he could describe the visceral reaction of just how the black goo is being sprayed off of his blade and splats next to the next zombie, knocking it over. Or perhaps there was another player next to him, and he just cut through the zombie and could describe how it went through and hit another player. And it gives the GM a lot more freedom to describe how the tattered, rotten clothes, a putrid smell, just explode from its chest cavity because of what the warrior did. And now you're painting that smell and goop and sound rather than he took 1 point of damage, but he's not dead yet. You don't say bloodied. You just move on and describe this disgusting scene, because truly fighting a zombie isn't a clean thing. There's going to be goop everywhere. And we're going to take a slight pause and ask anybody have questions on how the GM is encouraging players through this more narrative, theater of the mind, gridless option. Malcolm.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that a second. You said instead of saying bloodied, you can describe the situation of the monster.
The system that we usually use on Pathfinder, and I think D&D also uses it, is when the health of a creature gets to a certain level, you say bloody to let the players know how much damage is done. But the freedom of the gridless system is you're not sweating the small stuff of every rigid rule, but now get to describe what's happening to the zombie based on how much health it has.
So one of the zombie's arms fall off, and then he's just slowly he's not moving as fast as he used to, and then that kind of acts as an indication to the players.
Now they get a really good idea because they get feedback of, oh wow, that's what I did. Okay, then I need to maybe chop off his other arm or his head or do something else.
No, it fell off. He didn't chop it off. It just fell off because it's damaged. And he's not even his jaw just felt cracked a little too. From the blow.
These are all great examples of further things, because now they're getting an idea. And it gives you the freedom of increasing and decreasing the damage. Perhaps what they did was so amazing and described so well that the way they chopped through his arm into its body and ripped off part of its abdomen, you could be like, okay, that was a really good thing. It's not a 10 hit point zombie anymore. You know what? That was such a good roll. I want to just keep the story going, and it's a 3 HP zombie, because that's not sweating the small stuff. You don't have to be hardcore and rigid about how much health each one has. If it's emphasizes and highlights the overall feel of the setting you're in, now you are projecting that on, and they get that sense of, oh look, I'm an awesome hero guy who is greater than me. I just chopped a zombie in half.
I'd just like to add a little pin on that, by the way, too.
Yep, we're going to go down a list because it looks like everybody...
I really like how you managed with the system. I like how you managed to incorporate bluffing as an option, not necessarily something you have to do. You can increase or decrease the scale of the monster's health depending on how hard the blow was. And I can appreciate that as somebody who has had problems with the issue of having a tactical map already set up and the min-maxing among players resulting in complete destruction of my original setting. Because I was just going off these rigid rules, and I wasn't really inventing things like that.
That's a little trick a lot of gridless people use is because the harder the more rigid you are about the rules, the more you have to keep track of. And the more you have to keep track of, you start to just have a huge layout and papers and all these notes describing everything and trying to keep track of, well, that's one zombie, but what if you're fighting 10 zombies? Well, okay, maybe Justin went into the horde, did an awesome swing. You can say a horde. Well, what is that? Is that 10 or 20 or 30? It doesn't matter if it's this awesome cinematic move that Justin the warrior did and slice through, and you can just describe how a number of zombies fell and describe that more. And that's the freedom of scaling at a moment's notice without adding and subtracting tokens nor keeping track of each one's health.
All right, but in terms of style, you can make certain numbers specific depending on how you want players to go about things. Okay.
All of the suggestions that we're talking about vary from GM to GM, because like all of us know, all of us in this room are GMs, and all of us have our own unique style, things that we prefer. Emmerich, you got a question?
Yes, thank you. Well, you've been talking a lot about how grids and grid-based systems lock players and GMs into these statistics, and I think it also ties into this because I've had a lot of examples of that in my Pathfinder game because I wasn't used to the way my players expect things to be run in D&D. Basically, you have situations where, let's say, a warrior that's wielding a shield and a sword is charging at a zombie, and you describe it as he smacks the zombie with his shield and then delivers a damning blow with his sword to the zombie's head or such. And then somebody who's a rules lawyer at the table says, you don't get 2 attacks per round. You're 5th level, not 7th or something like that,
Yes.
And I also had a situation where a Cavalier player of mine was exploring. They were exploring a series of small hills, and he is right-handed, so his shield is on his left hand. And I described a warg attack where a warg jumped out of a den and bit him on his right hand, and I described it basically just simply flavor. The warg jumps out and bites you on your sword arm where your shield isn't covering, and immediately he goes, no, this is Pathfinder. I get my +2 regardless of the direction from which I'm attacked. And that's basically how they see things. They see it as a collection of armor class bonuses or stuff like that. It's
Which
constantly
can be,
in there.
Those are good points, because those things, those elements of the bonuses could be added and subtracted by the GM at will, and that's really when you have to foster that trust of your players. Or unfortunately, you're going to run into the things poor Emmerich was facing, people bringing up all of these scenarios and saying, oh, no, what about this +2, or what about this rule, or what about this one?
Rules lawyer.
We typically call him that, but he's also referring to that we haven't built that trust up. And that is a big, big thing, is we have to build trust in our players, or they're going to attack us, because legitimately they're bringing up a fair point. They read rules, we read rules, and they might be confused.
Well, exactly. The system itself encourages that kind of thinking.
Yes. But it's not hopeless to run it at this. 4th edition is very, very, very rigid, to the point that we moved to Pathfinder, which is still a strong, strong gridless system. Most of the abilities and attacks and everything are based on the grid. But remember, we're not sweating the small stuff, so we get rid of the things that take away that cinematic narrative feel. And Justin had a question.
Yeah, I really like that idea of having the player describe what their actions to do would be, rather than saying, well, let's look at, this skill, and okay, I'm gonna do this, and let's look at like this ability over here, and I'm gonna do that. And so I like that idea, and then it seems like it puts the player more in their character. But then, as far as once they describe what they're trying to do, how would you handle it from there? Would you let the GM kind of look and see, like, okay, what skills would that require, what abilities would that require, and then roll from that? Or would you still leave it up to the player to figure that part out? And yeah, I'll leave it up to you now.
That's we have somebody in this chat that's actually one of my players that went through that specific thing. Is he wanted to we were fighting. I had a giant snake in front of them, and he was like, "Oh, giant snake, and I can't reach its head. It's like over 2 stories up." So he just said, "You know what? I'm going to climb the entire snake, and because I want to hit it in its face with my giant maul." So now you're like, okay, well, it's not an attack action, because that's what a grid system would do. You get near it, you're in range, you roll your melee attack. But this is like a great opportunity to add special things that his character gets to do. So he had to do an acrobatics roll just to climb the entire snake without being thrown off. Because you're just throwing out a skill that says, okay, that's relatively close with an acrobatic thing to keep his balance while he's climbing a snake that he's fighting. and then you do a reflex save to dodge the tail attack from the snake. Because I was like, that makes sense. It's a giant snake. It's not going to just sit there and take it. So then you throw in that skill. And then when he finally made it to the face, he got to attack it and ripped its jaw off and turned it into like a snake pinata. But those are like skills that are like, well, what relatively makes sense? Because that's what you're trying to think. Okay, relatively makes sense that he's going to do these types of feats of acrobats and using a reflex save or whatever it is. And so you would actually go through the list, and granted, you may make mistakes. In fact, sometimes players will say, well, wouldn't this one work better? And you go, yeah, that makes sense. So you roll with it. It's really good to encourage your players to have that feedback of saying, well, would this skill work better? Can I use this skill? Because now they're trusting you because they are now thinking outside the box. They're not thinking, can I just walk up and hit my attack roll? They want to describe their character, so they want to know which skills can I use more. It's not just my D20, my base attack skill. And so now you're growing and growing. So you always want to encourage that. Thomas, you got a question? Thomas says, certainly all for encouraging awesome description, but too much, and your players use description as a means to do more damage, which completely mitigates the use of the dice. How do we make missing or only doing some damage interesting and fun? Is that how some of you guys were thinking? How do you balance? Because if they're going from now, yes, if that's how the players are thinking of how descriptions equal more damage, then they're still stuck in that grid system. They're thinking, well, if I get to the square next to the enemy, that's considered flanking. Or what if I get into this position? It's an attack of opportunity. So they're still stuck in that grid system. So you need to describe. They need to describe what they're doing, and you give the pluses and minuses, the negatives, the bonuses, because perhaps you charged in a way that it was a blindside attack into the zombies. Well, then that gives a GM an opportunity to say, because this and this and this, or the way you did something, you get a +2 to hit, or a +1 to damage because the roll to hit was so high. You don't have to stick to only the natural 20s give damage bonuses. Perhaps it was just a DC of, or an AC of 10, and they rolled a 25, but it wasn't a natural 20, so they don't get a crit. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. They did something spectacular, so give them a bonus. But if you give it out all the time and that's what they're expecting, then you really need to start working in that this is a narrative, not a how can I use all these bonuses I got from the grid into it. So you still would have to work with your players. And some players may take time and may chafe a little because they may not be used to this, that it's a different way of thinking, because that really comes down to it's just a different way of thinking. CB had a question up top.
Yes, it's not necessarily a question, but just something to add.
Oh, comment. Yes,
discussion.
Please.
These techniques you've been talking about for this section, you can still pull these off in a gridded system if you want. You know, it's just that with that thing, it's more difficult for the players to get the mechanics out of the way and go with these more descriptive flowing actions. And, you know, providing good fluff. It's more like I'm going to move and, you know, get my advantage mechanically and not narratively. So you can still work the narrative advantages in, is what I'm trying to get at here, even in regular gridded play.
In the sense that narrative play still gives you bonuses if the players know what to say? Well,
I'm trying to think. What are
because that's still a mechanics first mentality.
Not necessarily that, but you know, you can still encourage your players to try and work more of the narrative in, even if you're using the grid system. You know, it's not. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I think what he's trying to say is that when you're trying to, like for example, that suggestion you gave with the giant snake, you could definitely have a grid in which this is all happening in, and you can have the narrative style involved with the grid system. Like if your character does something, like he chose to climb the snake, that would, I mean, yes, that would involve, like I would put maybe some climb checks up and some acrobatic checks to dodge the what's it called, the monster's tail. But you could still have a grid and do all of that. Like you don't need to simply have the narrative in order to apply narrative bonuses. I think was that what you're trying to say?
For the most part, yeah. And at the same time, you don't have to provide like number bonuses. You could also do more situational. Like you know, you maybe don't get a bonus to your attack, but you get behind him and he's not going to be able to get at you next, on his action. Those sorts of things as well.
Very true. And that's not to say that these are exclusive narrative techniques, but a lot of the things is people get it's almost like a myth of like, what is a narrative? Honestly, it's very close to what people play on a gridded, minus the focus of players stuck on a grid. And so the way you guys are mentioning, you guys already have, actually virtually every GM has it, is the tools to run a campaign gridless. Because of all the stuff you would do with a grid, you're just removing and giving them a greater opportunity for narrative and description, but you organize the battle the exact same way. You organize your encounter the exact same way. You organized us walking through this forest and meeting a strange house. And then we ran into some zombies. All of it's still basically the same idea. All you're doing is giving them just greater opportunity for that narrative. So when you see the similarities, you should put that in your mind and go, oh, it isn't a huge leap from what I've been GMing. That it isn't that much of a difference. It's just more descriptive. And that's why we want to say that it's an option, and not really compare the two of like good versus bad. That's a very good point to bring up, though. Down the list, Malcolm.
I honestly either forgot my question or it was already answered.
Okay, good. Emmerich popped up.
Yes, well, since we're talking about Pathfinder mostly, how would you go about adapting or perhaps discarding the attacks of opportunity that are a big part of tactical combat in Pathfinder?
The easiest thing was to remove them. I found that, and actually many of us GMs found that it slowed down. It was a mechanic that slowed things down to the point that in a narrative setting, just like you've experienced in many of the other games that you mentioned earlier, is we want to give players the freedom to do whatever they want, and then we describe how that interaction occurred. And so when people are looking for attacks of opportunity, well, that's actually something that's been done for a long time narratively already. Everybody should have the opportunity if it makes sense. But if you're only thinking in terms of, in this situation, I'm at this angle with this on this square, that's an attack of opportunity. I didn't take that one step, that 5-foot step, to say, okay, now I'm not. People now are limited into a chess match. But when you take away the attack of opportunity, you could still throw it in there. Because what if he rolled so badly or was so focused on the center zombie, the other zombies behind him now have a greater chance of hitting him? Technically, that'd be an attack of opportunity if they just got a free hit on him and just did an attack roll outside of all the initiatives and everything else. So you could still have the elements of it, but you remove it and put everything in a situational, everything is situational now. Because you're really trying to change how you view the encounter, not in the rigid, okay, this rule says it's an attack of opportunity every single time, even if the situation doesn't really make sense in a narrative or that exciting, fast-paced way.
Yes.
Did I answer
Thank
it?
you. But
or did I just sometimes say things that make sense to me, not anyone else?
You were very detailed. And
Okay.
Also, I have another question that kind of ties into that. You've been also talking about replacing all of those various action types with just the action, the one action. I'm actually used to that kind of an approach, but Pathfinder is oriented towards actions that are swift, like there are certain spells that you can quicken as a swift action and so on and so forth, that players invest a lot of their time imagining how they're going to optimize their characters to have these abilities, which they can later call upon as a swift action or a free action. How do we just outright tell the players right away that they can throw that out and start thinking a different way?
That's yeah, that's actually a very good point. That's actually the beginning of the trust, the character creation part, is explaining what the expectations are. Everybody in the groups that we've run we say what will and will not be allowed in the game, only because based on style. Because truly, this is a preference. This is a taste. This is a style, just an option. And since we run gridless, we go, okay, well, these things don't fit that, and take away that narrative that I want to have. So then you just say this and this and this won't be in it. And certain rules, such as having a swift action or a standard action or a move action or a free action, all get removed, along with attack of opportunity and a few other things. And that is one of the points on here about translating. What is it? How to translate rules to fit the gridless system. Is some things are grid specific, not role-playing specific. And because of that, you have to go, okay, do I judge this as a GM? This does not fit. I don't know how or don't want this specific rule. Because pretty much every role-playing game anybody's ever played has some homebrew in it somewhere. Somewhere it's in it. It's very rare that you find somebody that's completely 100% what's in the book. I'm not saying their GMs aren't in there. It's just more of a rarity. And so, yeah, because we do call them rule lawyers, so I guess there are some out there.
Well, some people are going to find it very hard to adapt to that, but also the system itself is designed in such a way that it presupposes the usage of these rules, because there's a lot of character features like certain clerical domains or schools of like sorcerer bloodlines and feats and traits and such that kind of do presuppose the usage of swift actions or quick actions or these things, and it all needs to then be adapted, or perhaps we would have to warn players to keep those in mind and give them replacement abilities instead of the ones that we've essentially discarded.
Him right there is a player in my group, and that actually came up. Is one of the things that everybody had to understand ahead of time is what we called, at least, as limited abilities. People had these things like certain skills or certain feats in Pathfinder. That's when you can blind a person because you had that feat. Or you have a power strike. And they give you a special ability, like doing extra damage at the cost of accuracy. The narrative thrive on people being able to do what they want when they want. Such as if you take a swipe at somebody's eyes with a dagger, there's a good chance you're going to blind them. You don't need any special quality or special feat or skill or anything to do that. If you slash somebody across the eye, naturally you're going to have somebody that's going to be blinded in some manner. And having that always up front with your players, even those that prefer grid systems, such as there's a couple that are in my group that prefer grid system, but now understand where I'm coming from, and it's addressed, and that actually builds the trust of, oh, okay, I understand where it's coming from. And then we can talk through each of the skills that may or may not fit it. And the reason we're highlighting 3.5 and Pathfinder so much is because they're so grid heavy. But I still want to show how successful it can be, even with a system that promotes the grid with so many rules.
Just a question. I believe mine
Yes.
was next.
I lost track of everybody's stuff.
Yeah, it's a bit above, but I think mine came right after Emmerich's. Yeah, it did.
That's fine.
Okay. In relating to what he actually, I wanted to relate to what he was saying. I think doing surprise attacks are possible, but again, it would be very situational, and you would really have to trust the GM in order for them to seem like they were fair or reasonable. So, and I think trust is a really big issue as a GM. I mean, a lot of people would say that you shouldn't bluff certain things where you can get away with it, and a lot of people would, and I feel like with narrative style, you can bluff, but you really have to acquire player trust in order to do it appropriately, I think is the best way of putting it. And you really need to trust yourself that you are not going out of your way to harm a specific player in the process. And so I can understand why people might have problems with bluffing, especially in terms of when you're doing a narrative style system. But I feel like, do you feel like it could be used still as an effective tool in terms of trying to establish the way these things can work? Because, for example, the surprise attacks. Let's say a zombie was right behind you the whole time, and then none of you guys had noticed that. Did you not notice it because I didn't inform you of it, or did you not notice it because you didn't check for it, or you failed a perception check? Like, how do you incorporate bluffing effectively?
That's the other side of it. That's the two-prong approach. That's the two sides of the whole issue. Is the players need to trust the GM, but the GMs need to be fair as possible. Because, I mean, can you really trust somebody that's never fair? Especially when they control the entire world or environment that you're playing in.
Yeah, my question really is, how do you break, if you're improving and you're just throwing things out there, wouldn't it be difficult to determine what is fair at the time, especially if you're just kind of spitballing an idea out, or how do you incorporate bluffing effectively into a situation? That's what I'm trying to ask.
Well, your example of a zombie sneak attack, that is very. It could be situational as it came around a tree. Well, then they're going to be like, oh, I didn't notice that behind the tree. Because you're in the middle of a battle and you didn't see a zombie come out of it, or you're in a creepy house and there's no lights, and you get attacked from the shadows. Well, obviously that's a blind attack. But if you just say that, oh, you were sneak attacked by a zombie, and you lose your advantage and blah blah blah, and you go through it, then they kind of feel like you're attacking them, and those are basic GM principles of the GM isn't the enemy, and it carries over to you're trying to instill that trust and be fair as possible. At all times, even if it's just a random, haphazard. Okay, they ran across some zombies and one of them's a sneak attack because it makes sense of what's going on. Perhaps they're in a graveyard and there's lots of tombs that are really high and they don't see what's coming out, or perhaps a zombie came from the ground and starts to grab them. That's a natural thing that makes sense because a lot of it is you're just using a common sense judgment rule to be fair as possible.
Okay, so you have a condition that makes the thing make sense, have some sort of justification as to why this thing is happening and why you missed it.
Yes, because that now you're being fair, and they're like, oh, I totally see why, and now they're building trust in you. For the next time that happens, they're like, well, yeah, it totally makes sense because he described how it just came from the ground or around that tomb.
Yeah, just shot a zombie just shot out from the graveyard and just grabbed somebody's leg, and now you're kind of stuck there.
And that's completely just spitballing it of. That just sounded really cool as a GM because they weren't paying attention. Okay. And you can snowball the effect. Perhaps you only thought it was going to be 3 zombies, but now it's snowballing. It's a really cool encounter, and you were like, no, let's keep this going. And you make them come out of the ground now.
And then maybe you could perhaps have the guys roll perception check ahead of time, and if nobody successfully rolls it, then the person who is going to be attacked anyways is getting attacked, and because they didn't notice it, but maybe somebody could react in time before they're attacked.
Sometimes that's the case, and another thing is to really build trust in the players is they'll sometimes ask, can I roll a perception check to know that there was a zombie behind me because I have this nature skill that makes me aware of my surroundings. And you're
perhaps you just have a high perception.
That's a very and so now they're asking and trying to build that trust, and so as a GM,
and then you can just say yes to it.
You're like, well, that makes a lot of sense because that's what we're doing. You're not a rule lawyer, you're just trying to make sense. Let's do it. And now they're all built. It's like a cooperative experience now.
So that's how and that it can very well incorporate the saying yes to everything because it allows for players to kind of right.
Yeah, that's a very good principle to have.
So I mean, I know, but you can incorporate, but it's very effective for the narrative style because it allows you to build that trust because what they're doing makes sense, and as long as it generally makes sense, you can allow that to happen. It helps them in building the trust.
Yes.
So it works very well. Would you say that it works very well for the narrative system if done properly?
That's a very, very good way to build the trust because now they get the sense of, oh, I said something that makes sense. That's reinforced by him doing something positive. Okay, I'm going to try to make sense next time. And so now they're starting to get more narrative. And they'll start moving along and go, well, does this make sense? Can I do this? And they'll start building that trust because you created an atmosphere of trust and let's play what makes sense. Let's build the story together. So that what you mentioned was a very, very good point.
All right, thank you.
A couple people have been making notes on the right side. I didn't want to miss. Does anybody have any other question before we move on to the last part? I'm reading it. Blah, blah, blah. Nope. Malcolm?
Didn't have any question. I was just responding to Thomas.
Oh.
I just think everybody, I don't feel like anybody else has any questions because nobody put any more question marks. So.
This was kind of touched on before. And it's the final part of we kind of talked about the mind's eye, how the benefits are of how it frees you up for random encounters. And we addressed the one thing I really, really want to touch on. You guys brought up a lot of good points on the feeling of being overwhelmed by not having these other tools of tokens and maps and grids. Is there any other types of feelings of being overwhelmed or the fact that it's hard to organize an encounter? Or do you see the similarities in a grid versus gridless system? It's opened up to everybody.
I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Is basically I want to make sure that all the concerns of how to organize an encounter or features of being overwhelmed or not being overwhelmed or trying to manage these random encounters to make sure everybody understands what were the principles behind it of where you can free yourself from. It really takes a different way of thinking of not sweating the small stuff and removing certain features. But I want to make sure everybody got that point before we get to the last part. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to ask once about something else. What was it? Yes. In regards to when you set up an encounter, would you recommend having? I did ask this question before, but I don't feel like it was properly answered because again, when you're making stuff up on the fly, it is difficult to keep track of it. And what would you suggest for doing so? Like, I understand you said let's not sweat the small stuff, but when you're trying to keep track of it for the sake of a campaign, like let's say the players want to go back there one day. Do we just forget what has happened, or do we just kind of do our best to recall what has happened and kind of keep the setting around the same, or should we take notes on the issue and maybe like write a few things down from the encounter that occurred? Like, what would you suggest?
Justin. Justin has a comment.
Okay.
Oh, your mic is not working. I think he has to unmute it. Hello? No. Well, he's figuring that out. If it's part of if you know that's something that people are going to be interested in later because it was a meaningful event, I would personally make a note of it, whether it's on paper or in Notepad or in Word or any type of document that you just keep your overall all the plot points that you have. Justin, were you able to get your mic working to add a point? No. Oh, no. Oh, that's too bad we lost. Am I the only one that can't hear him, or? Nope.
Okay, I'll just toss in something here.
Sure, please.
So yeah, if you can keep your own notes, but you can also, if your players are probably going to have some notes of their own, so you can always ask to get a copy of theirs and see what's been important for them. And then when you're going back through, you'll know to, hey, this is something they're interested in. I'll try and work around a little bit more with this.
Thank you for bringing that up. That actually just happened. It was something that I didn't particularly think was something huge. It was just something that I wanted them to encounter because the pacing felt a little off, so I wanted to add a little something extra. And they actually wrote a note about it. And so I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to make sure they swing back by that town and do something, or at least have some type of invitation. Oh, we lost one of our guys. It's having. Oh, we lost the guy that asked the question. Oh, you can see the video. is having the player notes that's a really, really, really great idea, John. Is always looking at your players' sheets from time to time, especially if you're actually creating a story or like a plot. You're actually going through the entire arc. I know some GMs run just open situations, just have settings, and every week is just something different. But if you have something interesting to them, they're definitely going to record that. Oh, Malcolm, you came back. We lost you for a second. Oh, I think he's trying to get it all back. Anybody have just questions in general of the gridless system? Points that perhaps weren't highlighted, or something that still seems you're unsure of or unclear, or anything?
It's not really. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
It's not really a question, but I was thinking before doing this that I was a lot more interested in a grid, and now after doing this, I think getting away from the grid actually sounds a lot more interesting.
I appreciate having converts because I think it's a lot of people like Emmerich mentioned is if you were introduced to role playing through a particular system or game, that's pretty much what people know, and they're like, okay, this is all there is. And if they do it for years, and they think, oh, that's all there is. This is what role playing is. And if they haven't expanded to other systems because perhaps they were always in a local group and didn't have this awesome platform of Roll20, which opens everything up to everybody, is people just don't know that this is actually how it's been for pretty much 80% of all role-playing games since the 70s. It's been like this. It's only a few systems that actually really, really, really promote grid. It's not that you couldn't have grids in all the other ones, but there's only a few that highly promote it. And Thomas, you got a question. How do you go about character creation when we intend to ignore certain very important mechanics or mechanical elements such as attack of opportunity? And Malcolm felt that same way. It goes back to explaining right in the beginning what your style is, because that's really what you're doing. You're promoting your personal GMing style, and if this is the style that you would like to run or prefer to run, then you explain that early on that mechanic of attack of opportunity is being removed, and it's only removed in an automatic sense, such as the players know exactly what to do with their character and this particular skill in action. We'll give them that attack of opportunity just for the bonus. Then that's what you're doing. Is they're like, I want this mechanic, and you're really trying to help them understand that the mechanic supports story, not the story supporting mechanic. And so you want to say, well, it's being removed. However, when you do things that make sense, so you have a character that says, I'm going to hide by that doorway, kneel down, and wait for the guard to come in and attack him. Well, now you give him a bonus of attack of opportunity. But you don't have to call it that. You don't have to call it a mechanic. You just give them an ability of a sneak attack or whatever it is, because it just naturally makes sense. So you're kind of just, I'm sorry, your mic is actually a little low, you're actually just creating a that uses a mechanic, but you don't have to actually call it that each time, because you don't want the players to always think in specific tactical ways, because that's what this system doesn't lend to, that really rigid tactical nature. So you can still use the mechanics, but just in different situations and call it something different. It's just really important to be upfront with your players about that. Yes, very good, CB. Yeah, it's not about automatically removing a mechanic. It's just about how do you rework it that fits a gridless narrative system. And as you're upfront with your players, they'll come to understand it, especially when they see it in practice. They'll really start to understand, like, oh, okay, this is what he's doing. This is how he's running. And Malcolm.
Sorry, I was trying to have my mic muted, and I was talking to somebody else at the time, but I wanted to actually add on to what Thomas was saying. I feel like in answering his question, I feel like you should have them write down what they normally would, but just make sure they've kept in mind, like for a Pathfinder game, write down everything you would on a character sheet, but just keep in mind that it's a gridless system. And also, you could take advantage in terms of reworking it, as CB had mentioned. Like, let's say, for example, that your character is far away, very far away, but they're slowed down by the armor. You could incorporate that into their running towards somebody, and maybe having them being tired out could incorporate into that as well, as kind of the armor check penalty, or some other things like that. But I feel like they don't really need to change how they would normally write it down, but just keep in mind that certain mechanics might not work the same way, and just highlight that when you're talking about how you intend to do things for the gridless system. Does that make any sense?
That's a very good point. Is you really want to try to highlight, at least in this system, a story-first mentality. And Malcolm did a very good job of describing a story-first approach, or at least a narrative approach, versus a mechanic approach, because you're not really getting rid of one or the other. You're just talking about what are you emphasizing more than the other, and that's what the gridless option gives you. Before we wrap it up, does anybody have...
Yeah, I have a question.
Emmerich, yes.
It ties into a lot of what's been said in the last few minutes. Basically, forgive me if I'm sounding incredibly ignorant right now. But
there's no such thing as a bad question, except for the ones you don't ask.
There is, believe me. Basically, you've been talking a lot about these adapted rules, so I'm wondering, you've obviously been doing this for a while. Do you have some kind of a compendium or a private collection of rules that you intend to publish or have published that we can perhaps use to run our own off-the-grid campaigns?
Oh, that's something I never actually thought of. If it's... because in my mind, I'm always approach it as everything is gridless. That's just a natural way of GMing. So when I wanted to run D&D with a starter group, I didn't know how well it was going to take off or not. And we end up with Pathfinder just because there's a lot of resource on it and there's a lot of new players. And so we just built it. And when I looked through all the rules, I realized, wow, these are a lot of things that I have to fight against. So I went from 4th edition, because I was swimming upstream too much on that one, to Pathfinder, which was a little more workable. People that played World the World of Darkness, really know the freedom of infinite skills. But not everybody's used to that level of freedom, so we stuck to a Pathfinder situation. So I really never thought of writing, I guess, what is that, an appendium of alternate rules for Pathfinder system?
I think what he was trying to say, though, was, like, do you have, like, this alternate... Could you write down, like, this alternate, like incorporate, like, for example, if you're playing Pathfinder, are there like, from what you've understood from playing with the gridless system, are there these certain adjustments that you would recommend that would be better to fit the player's narrative style? Yeah, suggestions.
I never actually thought about that. But if there's actually a lot of interest in it, maybe that'd be like another project to continue after this this video.
I'd be interested in it personally.
Yeah, me too.
Oh,
Like
okay.
your addition, like your suggestions of how to rework mechanics to make sense with a gridless system.
Oh, okay. That's definitely going to think about that because I never. This is the first time I'm thinking about that. So all you people on YouTube, you can just wait.
Or make
Wait
comments.
and see
Like,
because
show
I
your
really didn't
suggestion.
know.
Well, I'm
make
sure you.
suggestions in the comments, definitely, if you're interested in that.
No,
I'm sure you've
that's.
had a lot.
Say it again.
I'm sure you had a lot more experience with it than, especially with Pathfinder, since you've said that you've done a lot of that. And instead of retreading the things that you've already done, perhaps we could benefit from your wisdom and experience, as it were.
Yeah, that's actually a great suggestion, Emmerich. I would agree with that.
Thank you.
That'd be interesting.
Occasionally I get lucky.
All right. That's okay. That's definitely something I got to think about. I didn't realize. Maybe that'll be a good support to this video to have a further listing of different alternate rules and such. And I'm gonna thumbs up to somebody. Is that what you're gonna ask? When's it coming out? 'Cause I don't know.
No, I was wondering. So I'm not familiar with really any other role-playing systems, and about a week and a half ago, I got the 4th edition for GURPS, and been going through that, and it seems like it's pretty suitable for either a grid or a gridless system. And I'm wondering, are most other systems based around a grid?
I only can tell you what I've played, and D&D seems to be the ones that push grid more than other systems, and Pathfinder. I haven't noticed a lot of them. I'm not saying they don't. Yeah, there's also a lot of indie games I couldn't even comment on that I just don't know about. There's so many games that I just don't have experience with. I've played a lot of the major ones, I guess you can call it, like Rifts, and Star Wars, and several different versions of D&D, Cyberpunk, and Marvel, several homebrewed zombie versions, and different types of World of Darkness, which has a whole bunch like Masquerade and the Fairies and all sorts of stuff. And I've never played a game that actually emphasized the grid system. So this is the Pathfinder and D&D 3.5 are the strongest ones, and it's still such a hugely popular genre and theme that this is why I've spent the most time on actually creating the video, because I see a lot of comments, and almost all of them are exclusively towards those games. Everybody comments on how do you have a gridless system on Pathfinder? How do you have one on D&D? And they talk about it over and over. I don't normally hear it about other systems. I'm not saying they don't have grids. I just haven't heard. At least the need hasn't been there, or maybe they're just not as popular, and I just haven't read about them.
I'll say I primarily run Savage World, and that game is designed to be run on a grid, but it works very, very well without one because there's not a huge emphasis on positioning.
Okay.
So
in GURPS, it's similar. GURPS has a very detailed grid-based system based on hexes, but it's an entirely optional part of the game. It's not integrated into the system itself the way Pathfinder's grid is. And, well, that's pretty much true of all of aspects of GURPS.
Would any of you guys say the same? What would you guys say about the old Star Wars RPG, not the one published by Wizards of the Coast? Like, would that work well under gridless? Any of you have experience with that?
The old D6 is
yeah, the old D6 one.
Purely gridless. It does have different measurements that you could use for meters. But before we go off on all the different games that don't have
thanks
gridless,
for that,
we will continue this stuff off broadcast. Sorry, YouTube guys, you don't get to hear it. Does anybody have one final question? Because it really comes down to, I was going to describe what this manner was, but you guys did such a good job of understanding environments and how to create them randomly, and how to actually use a gridless system. You guys really are taking heart, or at least understanding what's being said. and understanding what it means to don't sweat the small stuff, which includes rules, distance, and counting specific health if it doesn't make sense. Anybody have any more final questions before we sign off? Unfortunately, I went a little bit longer than I wanted to, and I really appreciate everybody's participation and actually joining us here at the GM Workshop. Any final comments before we conclude this?
I just want to say that I thoroughly enjoyed the gridless workshop system, and yeah, I would also thank you for hosting this, as Justin is doing. It really makes a lot of sense. Honestly, a lot more sense than the systems we have nowadays. And now I feel like I better understand the criticism of certain games, such as 4th edition D&D when it was originally released, as a result of how it completely negates people who enjoy the gridless system in a lot of aspects. And it helps me better understand the argument of RPGs in general and why they were so popular to begin with and why they are still popular today. And really, I can appreciate the imaginative setup of that. I feel like I can appreciate that more as a result of this workshop.
Looks like a lot of people are commenting and share the same sentiments. Just to reiterate that this is the GM Workshop off the grid, and always remember, don't sweat the small stuff. We highlighted benefits of using the mind's eye rather than the maps, and Malcolm just talked about that. Addressing feelings of being overwhelmed by not having tokens. Who wants to briefly wrap that part up?
I just feel like at the end of the day, when it comes to having tokens, you don't necessarily need them, because again, it goes back to don't sweat the small stuff. Because yeah, there might be a lot of zombies, but you can be, with the lack of a grid, you can be vague. You don't necessarily need to share how many zombies there are. If you want to add more, you can. If you want to take away some, you can. You don't really need, and as long as you make the player experience more enjoyable through it, you don't really need tokens to keep track of things.
Good.
Because you can be vague.
Somebody would like to describe how they understand how to translate rules to fit a gridless system? Or I'll volunteer.
I'll do it again if nobody wants to.
I'm going to volunteer somebody.
I'll do it again.
Okay, I guess Malcolm's doing it.
When it comes to translating the rules to fit a gridless system, it always goes back to don't sweat the small stuff. And there are definitely things you can take out and put in, or even rework to incorporate it into the gridless system. But you always have to focus more. Always, the story is a priority, and as long as you can focus on that point, anything else that you throw in can either be flavor or can be really legitimately enhance the experience of the story. But as long as it's enhancing the experience of the story, that is what matters. Did that make sense?
Very good.
Okay.
The last part is ways to organize and manage encounters. Emmerich, I remember you spoke about that several times. Do you want to quickly reiterate that highlight?
Yes. Well, the most important thing, of course, is not to get bogged down too much with abstract numbers and definitive counts of various participants, like monsters and stuff like that, hit points. It's important to describe the layout of the situation in perhaps more visceral terms, where players get a feeling for the environment they're in. Perhaps they're in a boggy swamp or an arid desert, and they'll immediately have some clue as to what kind of terrain they're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And also, the description of the monsters and the encounter itself can tell you a lot about what you can expect. If the enemy is on an elevated ground, it makes sense that they have, say, bonuses to ranged attacks, and you have penalties, or you can charge uphill at full speed, or things like that. So essentially, description and reliance on players to self-moderate their actions.
Very good. And each of you guys, in just a few words, how would you describe the prime principle? By Kamikaze Midget, that's right. I am taking your awesome quote that is one of my favorite ways of describing the system. Don't sweat the small stuff. We're going to go down the list. If your mic is working. Blake. Mic's not working. Emmerich.
Well, basically, it's just a reiteration of everything we've been saying so far, especially you. It's important not to get too hung up on numbers, on absolute positioning, on certain rules that detract more from the experience within a gridless system than they would add to it, like attacks of opportunity and different types of actions. The most important thing is the narrative style and the immersion of the players so that they may buy into the game and actually feel as though they're participating in a fantastic scenario or a story, that they're immersed in a story and not constantly thinking about the various numbers involved in the game.
Very good, thank you. Jason, is your mic working? No, it's not. John.
I say it's basically just in work for you so that you can, keep things moving and fun, and so you're not like, oh my God, how am I gonna deal with, wherever, just make it work. Don't worry about making it work. If that makes any sense.
I think there's a lot of people just nodding their head right now watching this. Justin, how would you highlight don't sweat the small stuff? What was a prime principle? What was a prime thing for you? Is your mic still not working? Moving on to Malcolm.
Sorry.
Oh, wait, no, Justin's back.
Oh, I'm sorry, was that addressed to me?
Yeah, we're going down the list, asking each of the GMs real quick, what is it, how would you describe don't sweat the small stuff, the prime principle? What was a quick highlight? Highlighting that principle.
Just don't worry about all the details of where everything is in 3D space, basically. Just keep the narrative going, I think.
Awesome. And Malcolm?
No, I kind of have an unrelated question. I was just quickly looking through my bestiarity lists, and I'm wondering how I would be able to incorporate monsters from these directly into an impromptu kind of like let's just say the characters encounter something in the house, but I don't exactly have something prepared for what they would encounter in order to make the situation of being in the house more interesting. I feel like I'm worried that I might ruin the pacing by entering a monster, having to search for a monster in the bestiarity. Like, how would you suggest going about adding monsters to a situation that generally makes sense with the whole thing? Does it really? I mean, I feel like it might go back to don't sweat the small stuff, but at the same time, I do want to keep certain things specific for the sake of making sense.
To highlight that point, I'm gonna let one of my other fellow GMs describe don't sweat the small stuff to that situation. How would somebody apply that? And this is going to be our final comment.
I would say have a few encounters ready ahead of time. It's not maybe the place where you wanted to use it originally, but if it fits, it fits there. It doesn't have to fit where you originally thought it was going to fit. Have a little bit of preparation, but don't have it stuck to where you prepared it for.
All right, thank you. Like have some monsters just prepared for the terrain.
Is terrain specific or location specific? Is don't sweat the small stuff. You have a bear and a wood imp that likes daggers, and they're like in the forest. If it makes sense, add those creatures at appropriate times as the party's walking through the forest. Does it matter when or how? No, because you don't really care. You're just moving the story along and fitting things in a logical manner, and don't have to have it all gridded out.
Yeah, keep in mind the abilities of the monsters, their iconic abilities. So if you have a monster that can teleport, it makes sense that it can get, say, a flanking bonus or surprise the players. Or if it has a powerful charge attack, it makes sense that it gets bonuses on its initial attack. So it's important to keep these things in mind, not the specifics of its movement rate or its, I don't know, reflex save so much. I mean, so much as these key abilities that make them iconic.
All right.
And you can always reskin any monster to make it look however you would make it fit in a certain situation. So if you had a wood elf and a bear, and you're in like a inner city inn, it's a trained bear, and she, it's
Circus
her
bear.
pet. Yeah, if you throw something that's completely out of whack, maybe your players are going to like that, or
and a circus
like
elf
that.
with a bear. That
Yeah.
actually sounds really interesting. Okay, I'd just like to thank everybody again, all of my fellow GMs, for supporting this workshop, and I hope everybody that watches this video at least gets something to think about, and really hope that haven't tried the grid system, at least try it, and don't worry about not knowing the rules enough to go off the grid. It really, as long as you're having fun, that's going to encourage and be infectious with your players. They're really going to appreciate you going off the grid and building a narrative. It may feel a little awkward or clunky, but they'll start getting into it right away. Just like anybody that starts in role-playing, it may feel a little weird, but you'll get used to it right away. It's a natural way of talking. It's just a narrative storytelling thing, something that all humans do all around the world, whether they're playing a game or talking about something that happened during their day. I really highly encourage at least trying this option. And once again, I'd like to thank Roll20 for giving us an amazing platform to experience different ways to role-play with all these amazing players and GMs from around the world. And this is GM Keegan from the GM Academy, signing off.